thank you for coming over here, and thanks to all of you here at GDAE for inviting me both today but even more last month to get the opportunity to put down in writing some of the things that I've been thinking about, knowing, and talking with other people about in relation to the situation in Puerto Rico in the aftermath of the hurricanes. But one of the things that I'm hoping to show is that what happened there is not just about the hurricanes. It's easy to say it's a natural disaster, but as some folks have been saying, these things are highly unnatural disasters because, yes, you have the storms, and they're powerful, and they do damage, but what kind of damage and how much and for how long actually has little to do with the storm itself. At that point, it's really about what it's found in its way, and it's the people, the society, the structures, how things work. So, anyway, I'll try to go through a number of things. I'm not following, for those of you who have seen the paper that was published in December, I'm not going to follow it so that you're not bored saying, oh, I know exactly what's coming. But I am pulling some data from there, and some from the footnotes, and some update of what's happened since then. So, okay. Wait a minute. It's this one here, right? It should do it. Is it turned on for sure?
No, it's in the middle of that.
It's going to use the arrows here again.
Mm-hmm.
Does the pointer work?
Yeah.
Pointer does work.
Okay. Let's try this arrow here. That's interesting. That was just a regular opening up. All right. So what I want to do is draw attention not just to what happened there, but actually I think what happened there is relevant and has lessons for outside Puerto Rico, particularly places like the Caribbean and other small island, as they're called now, small island independent states. But I think even for Boston and Massachusetts and other places, we're not exempt from some of these things. What I think the devastation and the magnitude of what's happened there is so stark that I think it actually makes it easier to notice things that otherwise we may not normally notice. And I think the scale, the intensity, the pace, and the frequency of what happened with these storms, not just the one, Maria at the end, but I think what happened this hurricane season actually says a lot about what we really need to be thinking about in terms of resilience to extreme climate events. And I think one of the things that it highlights is that it's really not just about a storm. It's really how everything interacts, right? The infrastructure, the financial situation of the place that you're in, Puerto Rico, it's a good example of that. The social composition and how even the places run, the institutions and so on. And in the case of Puerto Rico, it's especially important because it all came after a very long period of economic, spiraling difficulties and problems. And I think this is an observation that I think is, to me, it just jumps out of it, which is that these things are not just economic and technological. What the scale of the damage and of what is going to happen, how long it's going to take to recover if it happens, has a lot to do with also the social conditions in the island and in wherever this would happen, which is in this case there's a high level of poverty and inequality, and that defines a lot of what the situation is. I'll get into that a little bit more. So I think what that tells me is that there's been a growing amount of talk in the last few years about resilience, climate resilience, being prepared, and all that stuff. The magnitude of the cost of what's happening, and I don't mean cost only in terms of dollars, but in terms of human impact, is so high that it makes it easier to think about what is the real value of investing in resilience and what's come to be known as climate justice, which is thinking about resilience and the situation in terms of how different sectors are affected, and very quickly, and we'll get into that, what's happening in Puerto Rico, it's affecting different groups of the population in extremely different ways. So the bottom line is that tackling these problems and the challenge for the future, you can't just target, infrastructure or this or that. The only way to really have long-term lasting solutions is investing in things that give you the energy system that can survive these events or at least minimize the disruption, bring down energy costs. In Puerto Rico, that's a real problem. But also, as I'll get into, in the case of Puerto Rico and islands like that, reducing greenhouse gas emissions is actually has a tremendous economic positive impact once you achieve it. It's not easy to do that because so much money is spent importing fuel from outside. It's a staggering amount of money. So you can get into a situation where the trick is how to get there, but if you can transition to lowering your dependence on it's really expensive volatile foreign imports of oil and gas and so on, you can actually, that money starts having, that's money siphoned out of the economy, and it starts having you can do other things that help bring electricity rates, which are extremely high, and you can get the economy in a better footing. And again, traditionally, people would say, well, it's very nice to talk about achieving high levels of resilience, but that's very expensive. And I think in Puerto Rico right now, people are saying, you got to be kidding. What's really expensive is not having done it, or not having done enough of it. And I think that's really an essential lesson. So yes, energy is, and the electricity system that completely collapsed, and for a number of reasons that we'll get into, is an important thing, and having a new system, more state-of-the-art, looking towards the future is important. But it's critical, but it's not enough because it doesn't function either. You don't just have electricity to have electricity. It's for enabling all kinds of other things in the country, in the society. So the socioeconomic situation and how that's handled is crucial. And for that gets into things of who makes decisions, how much participation there is in making decisions. And in Puerto Rico, that's been an issue and remains to be. And from that, then, for decisions to be made and be trusted, to have people buy into them and support them, you got to have accountability, you have transparency. Things are being made in a way that people say, well, that's, we tried, that's the best decision that we made. And we'll see that in Puerto Rico, that's been a real problem in the last few decades because of the politics. If you look around the island right now, what happened and to whom and how much really depends a lot on so many different things. I mean, clearly there's been a huge impact on the entire energy system. I mean, the number, 20 weeks later almost, later this week, a lot of people still have no electricity at all. The people who have it can be intermittent, so that's been a problem. Housing, the number of homes that have been destroyed is enormous. I've heard figures that something close to 500,000 homes have been damaged in a serious way, not just like a little cosmetic, and that something like 70,000 has just been completely demolished and destroyed. A lot of people were not insured. The poverty rate is very high in the population. There are a lot of professionals, middle class, but there's also a lot of people who have lower income levels. So there are a lot of people who live in homes that were not built to code, who have no insurance. They have no remedy now, and they have no remedy coming from the insurance companies. They also don't have any income and maybe no savings. So it's a real problem. So some people talk about the dangers now after all this, in the wake of all the storms, of what's going to come in the next year in terms of a lot of foreclosures, people who, a lot of displacement, a lot of, so the problems are going to compound. They're not going away once the electricity comes back. Right now, I'll show you a snapshot from this website that has an update on the situation. But right now, 20 weeks later almost, this is an estimate that about 30% of the customers are still without power. And that's from customers that they can track, right? There's a lot of informal, there are a lot of people who don't have accounts who get electricity one way or another. So there, you know, the economic, the issue of what's going to be recovery, nobody really wants to go back to the way it was. So what's going to be the transformed situation is the question that most people are interested in. Just a quick glance. This is not representative of what happened in the entire island, but these are real things. These are photographs that I've collected from a number of places, articles in the last several months. One of the things that so there's the unprecedented devastation. The hurricane crossed the island diagonally. The other thing is this hurricane came exactly 2 weeks after another hurricane, which just missed the tip of the Puerto Rico, the north coast. But Irma was one of the most powerful hurricanes in the last century. It, you know, did a lot of destruction in the rest of the Caribbean and Cuba, and then in Florida when it was, you know, towards its end. So it was strong enough that it actually knocked down power for over 1 million people. Tens of thousands of people lost water. Just when things were getting slightly back on their feet, and it did a lot of devastation. I mean, we're focusing on Puerto Rico, but the rest of the Caribbean, you know, Virgin Islands, British and U.S. Virgin Islands, Dominica, a lot of other islands were equally devastated. Puerto Rico after Irma was actually taking in people from the Virgin Islands, getting back on their feet when, on the 20th of September, Maria came by. It was Category 4, just a little bit. It had reached Category 5, and then it kind of weakened for a little bit, so it was actually on the upper end of Category 4, Category 5, and it took about 8 hours to cross the island. People that I've talked to said, trying to give an idea of where they were, what it was like. One person said, imagine being not far behind a jet engine for like 4, 6, 8 hours in a row, just being there. Another person talked about how the extended family gathered in this apartment, fairly modern apartment actually. Into the storm, the front door was blown off. So everybody who could huddle into a back room. A couple of the guys took a dining room table, flipped it, and put it to hold the door, and they had to do that for like 4 hours. So, you know, it was a very, very powerful storm. I don't know if you can see here, but sustained winds. I mean, above 120, 130 miles an hour for the entire storm, for most of the storm. Sometimes sustained winds even higher, and gusts approaching 200 miles an hour in some locations at certain times. Precipitation was just on the scale of Harvey as well. You know, I mean, over 20 inches overall in a large part of the island. In some places, up to 3 feet or even more. This is just in the case of, in the span of 1 day. So one of the things that I think this hurricane season makes us realize, again, thinking back to these issues, it brought together, so you think just these three, I mean, there were like a dozen hurricanes this season, but just thinking about Harvey, Irma, Maria, the 3 most damaging storms on record, they happened within a month. They were in different places, but within a month. What if they had happened? I mean, Irma and Maria almost happened in Puerto Rico. I mean, right? It just so any one place can be susceptible to more than one of these things. It hasn't happened at this intensity and scale in a long time. But that frequency of powerful storms, nobody who's lived in Texas, you know, in Houston, southern Florida, or the Caribbean this year is going to say, well, that's never going to happen again. We don't have to get ready for that. That's the new standard that people are going to have to, you know, prepare for. The other thing was the speed at which Maria developed from a tropical storm to a Category 1 hurricane to a Category 5 hurricane. So even if you were really well prepared, had plans, and you were going by traditional, you know, the way storms develop, they usually take their time. They just, you know, it's like a barrel picking up speed. if you don't prepare for these kinds of storms, all those plans may not be good enough, no matter how much money you've spent on them. In Puerto Rico, you know, it knocked out the entire electricity system, drinking water, and telecommunications. You know, those have been coming back a little faster than power. But even roads and bridges, you know, these are examples of this is in the northwest of San Juan, and this is in the west central part of the island. And this is, I forget where this is, but this is before and after. So a lot of places depended on generators. Those who could have them, and generators are not cheap, and the fuel is even more expensive. But to have them work, at some point you run out of fuel, you need more fuel. So in the early weeks, if you're depending on this road to get your fuel in, or anything in, it wasn't going to happen. So this is Puerto Rico. If you look at the map, all coast, but the entire central part is mountains, some of them quite tall. A lot of roads are like this. So there's a good road system, many bridges and all that, but once that's destroyed, you can't get there. It could be then a long time to get, a long way around to get there. Just a handful of things before, just to give you a little context. Puerto Rico, you know, has one of the largest economies in the Caribbean. On a per capita income, it's one of the better off places in Latin America. Very few places like Bahamas or something like that is better off. It has one of the extremely high levels of inequality. So in Puerto Rico, there's a very large educated middle class, a lot of professionals, a lot of people who studied in the island universities outside, but there's also a huge amount, you know, poverty rate has, in the last decade or so, has hovered in the 40%, which is twice Mississippi's rate, which is the most poor state in the U.S. One thing that I didn't mention here, it's a story well beyond what we can get into here. Puerto Rico, you know, is basically in a colonial relationship with the U.S., so that shaped the entire history. One of the things that about I don't know, in the after World War II, especially 50s and 60s, there was an arrangement made with the federal tax system that created incentives for American corporations to go there, function, and they wouldn't pay taxes in the U.S. on the money made there. And it led to this period of several decades of development where, you know, industrialization was happening. Beginning in the 80s and 90s, the U.S. Congress and administration started saying we're going to phase those out, and they did, beginning in the late 80s, I think. As many people predicted, just like doing that had led to a spiral upward, it went in the other direction. So the island economy has been in a downward cycle, slowly at first, for now really over 2 decades. The recession or depression here in the world economy just basically threw it into free fall. So Puerto Rico was in an extremely dire situation, leading to the island itself went into bankruptcy last year. It has a debt of about $74 billion plus another 50-some in unfunded liabilities. The electrical utility, PREPA, Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, itself owes about $9 billion in some additional obligations. In 2016, the Congress passed what's called PROMESA, the Puerto Rico Oversight Management and Economic Stability Act. And under that, it created this Fiscal Oversight and Management Board. In Puerto Rico, the Junta, which is the board. They're been given final authority over financial matters in Puerto Rico. So that's created a whole situation, a testy situation between the governor and the legislature, you know, a lot of issues about who has ultimate authority over what kind of issues. But it's a very real, it's an unelected, in Puerto Rico they say it, okay, this is imposed from above, and another part of the history of the relationship. Examples of where it gets testy, a few months ago, the board, they have a revitalization coordinator, they decided the Electrical Power Authority is just such a mess. We're going to name our guy to be in charge. The governor and the legislature and the authority said, no, you're way overstepping your bounds. It went to, there's a court, I didn't mention it here, there's a bankruptcy court, there's a judge that's handling, there's all these people who own debt from Puerto Rico. They are claiming their debt back even though there's no money to pay them. So there's this court that's handling these things. The court actually ruled in favor of Puerto Rico, saying that guy can't rule the power authority. He still has a lot of influence over what's going to happen. But high unemployment, workforce participation is on the low side. Immigration, because of all that, over the last, this is hard to see here, but this is 2016 here, immigration has been growing. So this is the population of the island, and it's just reached a peak a few years ago, and then it's just been, so before the storm, several tens of thousands of people have been coming to the U.S. That's accelerated tremendously in the last 4 months. Some figures say that from the hurricanes to the end of the year, it may be that another couple of 100,000 people, and continuing, right, into next year, because if you're there, the prospects are really grim for the next year or two, and you have the means to get on a flight and go Florida somewhere and find a job, especially in communities where there's a lot of Puerto Rican population, you can maybe stay with somebody for a while till you get set up. So that's happening. So that's not going to help things. It's going to help things from one perspective, right? They won't be needing the services that the government has to provide, but it's not going to help with revenue. It's not going to help the power authorities with less customers. So yeah.
Are they sending back remittances though?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a mixed situation. They're away. There's no revenue there, but they're sending their families. So one of the things, I know that this is very clear. One of the big successes of the Electrical Power Authority in Puerto Rico, which is a state monopoly, when it was in the 20th century, around the 30s or 40s, they consolidated. There were all these private electricity networks, and the state decided, for development purposes and for the good of the island, we're going to create a utility, and the goal was to take electricity everywhere in the island. And actually, they are considered one of the great success stories around the world, actually. They, considering the terrain in Puerto Rico, they actually were able to deliver within a few decades electricity to the most remote mountaintop settlement, and you can see that in these kinds of nighttime satellite pictures of, here's Florida, the places that are highly lit at night. The Caribbean is fairly dark except for Puerto Rico. That was before the storm. This is after the storm. So this is StatusTopPR. It's a website the government put up in the last few months, and they have all kinds of indicators. It goes down. It's like, ATMs, all kinds of schools, this and that. This is the Water Authority, and this is the Power Authority. I checked this morning, so this is a capture from this morning, although it hasn't really changed much. So they have been publishing. AE is the Autoridad, it's the same authority, Energía Eléctrica. So they've been reporting generation for many months, and initially that's all they reported. Highly misleading because it's generation compared to the level of generation before the storm, but it told you nothing about who's getting or not that power. Beginning a few weeks ago, they started reporting this, the percent of abonados. It's kind of like customers, subscribers, and actually this is the best it's been. So 81% generation, around 71.5% of customers. Even that doesn't tell you the full picture, because the distribution of who's getting electricity. Some towns have been getting, my sister lives in the metropolitan area in San Juan. Within the city, it was very erratic who got electricity when. Her place, she had electricity after a few weeks, or a couple of weeks. In other neighborhoods not far from her, there were people who took months to get electricity. San Juan got electricity much before many towns got electricity. There are a lot of people where the entire neighborhoods, entire towns don't have electricity. So these percents, anything you've always heard about, be careful about averages and statistics. it doesn't tell you the picture. There are places where it's zero people getting electricity. Yeah.
As far as this data management software that's tracking who is paying electricity, has it been used in another country or with another government?
I don't know if that's like a local website that they put up or if it's based on something from somewhere else. But I know that was something they tried to do. I don't know when it went up. Just started gathering information about all the different services and what's going on. So just to step back, I think what all this shows is that for places like Puerto Rico and in the Caribbean, the level, the scale of the risk involved, and this storm has brought everybody's attention to like sharp levels, is that there are very few people in Puerto Rico. You don't see a whole lot of this discussion about, oh, do we believe in climate change or not? They say, you know what, we're dealing with climate every year. The hurricane season is coming back now in a few months. So we don't have time. We pay attention to what hits us, and then we pay attention to what the people who really know about this stuff tells us is going to happen. So in reality, what this means is that what happened in 2017 now is the standard that they have to. They can't afford not to say that's what we got to be prepared for. It doesn't mean they can because the money is not there, but that's the standard regardless of what you may think is going to happen in the future. But also people who are paying attention to this stuff are saying, we can't just stay there. We need to start really paying attention to what's coming our way, especially if the most knowledgeable climate scientists are saying this is just the beginning. So it's that. So it's not just about preparing and adapting to big, powerful, extreme storms, right? In the Caribbean, these are things you have to worry about. Extremes in cycles between extreme precipitation and long droughts. And this has just been happening in the last few years. The entire Caribbean, and Puerto Rico was part of that. In 2015, it actually was longer, for about a year and a half. Cuba, the same thing, parts of the island, just extreme drought. You have to ration water. It's just not enough water. Then there are other times when you just have massive downpours. So those are things that we may not have to worry about it much here, but they have to worry about it. It's part of their annual reality. And I'll show you a couple of these other ones. The other things you have to worry about, it's an island surrounded by the ocean. They take seriously rising sea level because the water cannot go anywhere except in. And when that happens, when there's a storm on top of that, the water goes in further because the storm surge is that much. When you have erosion of the beaches, which has been measured now in University of Puerto Rico has been going around the island measuring, and sure enough, a lot of the beaches have been eroded. So now it's flatter. If another storm can happen right now, the water would be able to go in that much further until the beaches are replenished. And rising temperatures. So just to give you an idea, this is from, there's a gentleman at the University of Puerto Rico in Maya West, on the West Coast, the engineering university, for decades at this point. He and his team have been taking detailed measurements of sea level all around the island. And this is from San Juan, but this is typical of what's on all the island. So this here is 1960s till now. Basically, the trend up. In the last several years, the trend faster up, okay? So this is, people who look at the stuff in Puerto Rico, they take this stuff seriously because it's there. It's not like the other side of the world, it's all around them. This is something that was published a few months ago as well. Rafael Mendez Tejeda at the university. He took the data going back to 1950, low temperatures and high temperatures. Low temperature is anything below 59, high anything above basically 90. And they tracked the ratio between these two. And basically what they found is in 1950, for every cold day, the ratio went from this is wrong, this is 1.79. For every cold day, there were 1.8 hot days in that definition. Right now, it's basically for every one, there's 3.18 hot days. So basically, the trend is hotter. No getting around that. So this is a really where we get into where climate and the economy and energy come together. This is from 2008, but I thought it displayed well. This is carbon dioxide emissions in Latin America per capita, okay, per person. this is in the world. This is the U.S., Canada, what's this? Okay. Australia, Japan, UK. This is Latin America and the Caribbean. Trinidad, Tobago, oil producer, gas producer. You know, Puerto Rico is right there. So Puerto Rico in the Americas is very high, comparable to not poor countries around the world. So in Puerto Rico, on the one hand, people say, we're a small island. What happens to the climate depends on what the rest of the world is doing. All our energy has to go into adapting, getting ready and adapting for climate change. There's a counter side to that, which is, on the other hand, on a per capita basis, you're contributing enough, as much as other medium wealthy countries, so everybody has to actually contribute to reducing emissions, especially since you're the kind of place that if emissions lead to climate change and worsens these extreme events, that's self-interest would tell you you need to bring it down. Here's the this is the title there. I forget what the title is. This is basically fuel import costs in Puerto Rico. These are thousands. These are millions. So basically, over the last few years, from $1.5 billion to it peaked at $3 billion a year. You know, the population well, right now it's down to like 3.4 million. $3 billion a year in imports. That's a level of major items in the island's budget: health, education, public safety. So you have a situation where these costs feed electricity tariffs. The way things have been done in Puerto Rico is that whatever the tariff is, if fuel costs go up, like this did here, they'll automatically go into the tariff. It was just a mandate. So electricity rates in Puerto Rico are 2 or 3 times higher than anywhere in the U.S. Incomes are half of Mississippi, for example, which is the lowest per capita income. The burden that people feel, people in households, small businesses, whoever, university, is actually multiple times what anybody here, when you make a budget here and you pay for electricity, for energy, and all that stuff, the counterpart in Puerto Rico is basically saying 4 or 6 times the share is what they're dealing with. So it's a huge strain from the economy. And I'm not going to get into this, but for example, this is Puerto Rico also, because of the colonial type of relationship that's evolved, is a captive market for the U.S. This is a figure that I just got. This is 2016 shipments of goods, never mind services. Puerto Rico consumes a huge amount of services from Puerto Rico, from the U.S. $25 billion in 2016 imports of goods, physical goods from the U.S. How does that compare? Well, on a per capita basis, that's the same as Canada and Mexico, the U.S. biggest trading partners. Okay, it's 4 times Mexico's, about the same as Canada. And in absolute value, it's at the same level, you know, of the 11th to 15th consumers of U.S. products, you know, which are France, Brazil, Taiwan, Switzerland, Singapore. These are either huge countries or wealthy countries. On top of that, shipments in Puerto Rico are subject to the Jones Act. So anything that ships between the U.S. and Puerto Rico has to be on a vessel that's owned, built, and operated by U.S. citizens. That means that it's also cost more. You can't, you can't have a foreign ship do that between the U.S. and Puerto Rico. That was suspended for like 7 days after a month or so. When it happened with Harvey in Florida, that was suspended automatically a week after. In Puerto Rico, it took like a month or so for them to do it, and it was for like a very limited number of days. So the Power Authority, you know, in the mid-20th century, it was a real plus. It led to the development of the economy. It fostered industrialization, electricity everywhere in the island, pretty much. Later on, as that was behind them, there was a loss of the mission, and basically the Power Authority, the biggest employer in the island, except for the government itself, the management of it started being captive for the governor in turn. The political parties basically have been alternating power for now for about 40 years. And whoever goes in names their staff to manage the authority, the board and the management. 4 years later, the next one comes in, a clean slate, and brings up, these are high-paid, cushy jobs, not necessarily the most technically savvy people. I mean, they had to have some knowledge, but not necessarily the best. And it created this crony enterprise where very cushy, go in, get a high-paid job, retire, pension. The same thing happened at the level of the union, very powerful union, and it became so because of the same thing. People say, well, if that's happening at management level, legislators say, well, you want my support for this? Well, you know, help my cousin or my friend, my buddy, get into the union. You get into the union, you work 30 years, retire, good pension, you know. And it was a political machine also that helped politicians. So it became entrenched into this, one of the worst examples of what a big service organization should be. And not surprisingly, service has just been downhill. A year before the storms, 1 year before Maria, there was because of poor maintenance for many decades, there was a blackout for the entire island. It lasted a few days in most of the island. In a few places, it took actually a few weeks to get electricity. So this is before a damaging storm coming in and knocking things off. So this is already, and this is an example of where institutions, governance, all these things shape resilience, right? I mean, if you hadn't had 2 decades of or more of bad decisions, poor maintenance, poor investment, the system would have survived much better. And of course, you know, in July, it went into bankruptcy just a month before, or two before the collapse. So there's a tremendous amount of distrust in the island. The population is incredibly cynical. A lot of people are basically saying, just do something, anything, but whatever you do, get rid of the entire, don't let a politician anywhere near the institution. And so a lot of people are basically, hey, sell the damn thing, you know, that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, that doesn't always make for the best decisions. It makes it actually easier for private interests to come in and saying, we got big support, everybody wants to, you know, sell and buy. So that's one of the key dangers right now in the situation, which is that climate. These are in the way of update recently. Not long ago, the governor announced that we've decided this is an untenable situation. We're going to move toward a privatization of generation and of concessions on distribution and transmission. So that's become the new debating issue. The problem is that it's very complex. You have the governor and the legislature. You have that financial oversight body, which is increasingly paying attention to this. Last Thursday, they had an entire day focused on the Power Authority, public hearings on that in New York City. You have the bankruptcy court judge. You have the bondholders, and they're very aggressive. So, there are all these. The articles have been written about this. Some of the bondholders are people who bought municipal bonds or retirement funds and all that kind of stuff. A lot of it isn't. And then what happens in the last few years, as the value of these bonds went down, there are all these international investment groups that go around the world. They did it in Argentina and Greece. They say, well, this is a great deal. Buy it at 20% value, and now they have international lawyers. They can wait a decade. They just keep going in the courts. That happened in Argentina, and eventually the courts rule in your favor. And some of them were insisting on getting full payment back or 80% payment back or even more because they took a risk and all that kind of stuff. How these things play out is, and nobody knows the interaction, you know, this is really complex. How it plays out and who's going to have final authority is really how the future of this utility, which is a key institution, what happens there is the key. One interesting, surprisingly, it's surprising because no one thought it would ever happen. In 2014, the legislature approved, and the governor at that point signed a law creating the Puerto Rico Energy Commission. For the first time ever, there's been a regulating body, an independent regulating body, and they have, over the Power Authority, they have basically imposed, rate increases have to be approved, which means that they require documentation. They require for the first time an integrated resource plan. So it actually has begun to put in motion some correctives to this otherwise terrible situation. Unfortunately, a lot of things are political. It's a 3-member commission. 1 member has been vacant. 1 position has been vacant for almost a year. The first people said, well, there's a new governor. Needs time. It's been a year now, almost. A lot of people say there was a lot of opposition when this thing was created. The plan here is to let it wither away, especially since there have been proposals being floated to strip away some of its authority, saying it's too powerful. And last month they even said, why don't we merge it in the interest of efficiency? Merge it with the regulating bodies for telecommunications, transportation, and all that kind of stuff. A lot of people that sent, trigger signals, because that's happened in other parts of the world, in Spain and all this. Where you merge all these things, it's diluted because now, you're going to be an expert in telecommunications, transportation, electricity, and actually, in light of these proposals to sell off things, the more you privatize, the more you need a regulating body to say who's looking after the interests of the entire island, for the entire population. Only an independent body that's not subject to political manipulation like the authority itself would. So that's a big, huge challenge going forward. This is hard to see. The commission a year ago hired expert reports. One of them is from Massachusetts, Synapse Energy Economics. Some people here know folks there. They did this report, which is Jerry Fisher and Israel Horowitz. It's devastating to read. I'm just going to give you a few highlights, just so you get a sense of what the condition of this authority is. These are things from their report. PREPA is failing at the basic mandates of an electric utility to do, all these things. Current state, unambiguously one of crisis. Deferred maintenance and investment, lack of key staff, myopic management, focusing on large risky bets, infrastructure literally falling apart, unnecessarily high costs, out of compliance, disappearing options, quoting PREPA itself as an inefficient bureaucracy loaded with all these problems. They comment, it is difficult for us to overstate how concerning this is. And then it goes on and on. In some, we find energy efficiency in the sales forecast being consistent with its own claims, poor documentation. At most, first and most important, we conclude that PREPA's operational spending has not been consistent with operations of a safe and reliable utility since at least 2014, and on and on and on. So, where does it all go? Well, on the one hand, just stepping back to what I was saying earlier, Puerto Rico, like other islands, there's no choice, but you have to get better ready and more resilient to face these events. Everybody says, this is the new standard. We have to minimize the damage. You can't stop it all. You have to minimize the damages, the disruption, electricity, outages when they occur. So you need a modern, everybody's agreed now, a modern decentralized power system with increasing amount of renewables, microgrids, smart energy, all the stuff. There's now a consensus of that. How it's going to get achieved, the problem is the little problem of financial, organizational, political, institutional, all that kind of stuff. But one of the things that's also very clear is that as part of that, getting away from these costly imports of fuel, bringing in a little bit more security by having a better design system that's not so brittle and centralized, releasing all those billions of dollars to circulate in the economy, bring down electric rates, clean up the air a bit from all the pollution. It's a no-brainer that that's the direction that people need to go. The problem is this transformation, to have an independent regulating body that can ensure that the public interest is respected. And then the larger question that it brings up, and this is where I'm going to end up real quick, is that climate change, these whether you call them climate change impacts or consequences or not, they are, even what we see now, never mind what might happen in the future, it's very clear in Puerto Rico that the level of poverty and inequality defines a huge amount of what actually happened. The same storm, if Puerto Rico was all at the same level of development as the middle classes there, believe me, the damage would have been much. My sister's apartment had very little damage in some upper windows and all that, functioning fine. That's not the reality because there's a huge part of the population that doesn't live at those levels. And how does reconstruction happen? Are there going to be Are poorer people going to be helped to build stronger structures so that the next time, I mean, there's nothing that says that another Irma or Maria can't happen in a few months, right? Come next summer. So that is a crucial thing. So actually, this issue, you know, it's easy to say, oh, people talk about climate justice and it's all like good feeling and all that kind of stuff. It's actually hard economics. You know, if you invest in reducing those things, you're actually investing in hardening and preparing the island for dealing with these extremes. And the same goes with, you know, the damages. The opposite of the damages is what resilience really means, which is you have your critical systems, you know, transportation, energy, services, but also then there's the softer things, which is planning, you know, having operations, plannings in place, procedures, public education, having in the Caribbean, there's no excuse for every island being more like, this is something that Cuba does very well, not everything else to do as well, is to have the population well-trained whenever, and practice drills and all that stuff whenever disasters are looming and coming their way. You cannot afford not to have those kind of things. And also development that's compatible with the environment that you live in. Puerto Rico, for decades, there's been a collusion between politicians and business developers. Everybody wants to build condo buildings right on the sand, and they got automatic approval and funding and all this kind of stuff. Well, they've been scientists saying for decades, this is crazy. There's documentation, things that you built 2 decades ago, and now the ocean's hitting the walls. And so that, you know, that goes to governance, institutions. It doesn't have to do with technology and, you know, renewable energy. It just has to do with common sense practices. And for all of that, the only way that works is if you have, you know, transparent, accountable institutions that work. For things that have to do with resilience, what's the value of investing in improving all of these things? Well, it depends on the time frame that you take a look at. If you look at only a couple of years, people can say, well, you know, this was a one-off storm. We don't have to spend that much money getting ready for things. But if you look at many decades, then investing in improving all these things to make you resilient, improving in the obstacles to being resilient, which are the social and economic factors, it makes all the difference in the world. And that's kind of, I think, what the 2017 hurricane season has done, is just to bring into light things that have always been there, but, you know, in better days, they're not always that clear. And now I think they're definitely very clear. So anyway, sorry I took longer than.
We have time for questions.
You may not have any questions, but it's okay.
Hi. So one of the things I've looked at PREPA when I was at Synapse, and one of the things I couldn't see past was, as far as the short-term solution was, PREPA can't borrow money. Anytime they have to build, when we have utility investments in most of the U.S., you finance something over a 20, 30-year period. PREPA has to expense everything: transmission lines, power generators, whatever. And so you get this rate shock problem. Right. And I'm just curious how you feel. What is the solution, the medium to long term? I see 2 extremes. One is privatization, which you talked about a little bit, and the other is a federal bailout, essentially. Right. Which the latter is not probable until maybe after 2018. I don't know.
You know, I don't know. I mean, that's what I worry about. You know, like one of the things that has happened in the last few years, the legislation in Puerto Rico had mandated, for example, that they had to invest in renewable energy and allowing more solar homes to build solar, to put in solar panels and all that. By now, there should have been something like 12% of the electricity should be of that form by mandate. It's like 1 or 2. One of the reasons is that as PREPA was going into a downward spiral, and now in particular, the last thing they wanted is people to get out of their service, right? Right? So now that's even worse, because now you have tens of thousands of places that are just totally, I mean, they're not connected because there's nothing to connect. A lot more people interested in getting off the grid, or at least reducing their consumption from the grid. And then you have hundreds of thousands of people leaving the island. So their customer base, their paying base is just spiraling downward fast.
Right.
I had no idea. I mean, I think those institutions, the boards, the congressional thing, the bankruptcy judge, the governor and all that stuff, at some point, I mean, there are no free solutions. I mean, some people have said it's crazy. Unless you do away with a huge chunk of the debt, there's no, or radically define the rules of the game, there's just no way. I mean, how do you, I mean, you're right. I mean, how do you, if the main thing that the Synapse report is that you haven't invested in the right things or in the right amount for like decades, how do you start doing it in the first place? And the only way is to really, it has to be a complete new game. One of the concerns that people have with the privatization thing is what's going to happen. Are they going to buy a corresponding part of the debt? Or is it going to be the kind of thing where all these private interests come in, they get to buy a piece, a really bargain basement rate, and the government in Puerto Rico gets to pay the debt, you know, which is then, you know, it's no different from paying high rates, right? And it's not in your electric bill, it's in your taxes now. So, I don't know. It's, I wish I had an answer, but again, it comes down to how the interplay between all those institutions and the population, which, you know, I will rule out a growing amount of popular resistance to a lot of the political decisions that get made. If these people making decisions between the Financial Oversight Board and the Power Authority and the governor don't watch what other people are saying, you know, very few people trust them. There's an incredible amount of cynicism about what they're up to. Some people feel like, oh, the financial board, some of their people are basically people from the world of finance, and they're basically are they just covering for the bondholders and trying to figure out what the best deal they can get for them, or who's really supporting the population in Puerto Rico? Inevitably, what happens in all the stuff is whoever has the most mobilization and influence and power is probably going to get their way. But, I mean, ideally, you would think a huge part of the debt just has to be written off, because otherwise, it's not going to help anybody if the island then starts for the next 20 years crippled, and, you know, that's going to require funding as well. So, I mean, you would think that even in Congress at some point, some of these most conservative legislators would say, you know, that situation, a worse situation, it's just, you know, but I don't know. It's pretty grim, I think. I wish I had an answer.
Yeah. Yeah, nice presentation. I've thought for a while that the Philippines might be a model for what's going to happen in other parts of the world under climate change, because at the moment and for a while they experience multiple natural disasters every year, and I was reflecting on what's happened there in light of what you're saying here, and the kind of the political economy of it is that what happened is they kind of developed a reconstruction industry where public funds go to a small number of people who then specialize in rebuilding, but not building back better. They just rebuild every time they get. So I guess I would say as you're thinking about what might happen in the future, you're thinking about these political economy dynamics, and I just wonder if that might be one of them, that there's some capture by.
There are a lot of people really concerned about what happens when you have, just like when the situation is so dire and the population starts getting desperate. On the one hand, you have that phenomenon of people saying, do something. I don't care what, just do something. It's got to be better than what they're doing. The other one is get the politicians away from all decisions. Give it to private businesses and all that stuff. Other people saying, you know, that's how you open up corruption as well, right? I mean, they have plenty of experience. Many people in Puerto Rico are concerned that if we stay in this economically traumatized situation for a long time, what's going to keep a lot of outside investors just coming in, buying whatever they want for cheap, enormous swaths of land, coastal. If it's cheap enough and they have enough funds, they can wait the crisis to ride out 5, 10 years and then build whatever resource they want and all that kind of stuff. Essentially displacing the population to either out of the island or to secondary class status or third class status, because a lot of people feel like they're already second class status. So I mean that's along the lines of that, right? Of different interests coming in and saying, hey, this is gravy. I mean, this is going to happen all the time, so let's just make a business out of it, you know. And I think that's the reason why there is a lot of organizing in Puerto Rico, at the university and in many civic organizations, saying, you know, if we don't act for the community and for someone to represent our interests, we know what happens. We know that a lot of the politicians, I mean, not every politician in Puerto Rico is corrupt and all that, but we know that political parties have been just basically trading off interests. So we know what that's going to happen. If we don't step up, all decisions are going to be made without even thinking about us. So there is a lot of that going on. Next month, at the end of March, there's a group in Puerto Rico at the university called INESI. It translates to the National Institute for Energy and Island Sustainability. So a lot of the energy experts in the university system collaborate with them, but they're also not just energy technology experts, but people who deal with the politics and the social implications of things. And they, for many years, have been just engaging in gatherings like this, or much bigger seminars where they bring different experts and all that, trying to create the consensus that these are decisions that have to do not with just a technical expert. This is decisions about the future of the island, you know, who gets to have what, who gets to run things, who gets to pay for what. So there are many efforts going on in Puerto Rico like that, even at the level of immediate relief. It's amazing the number of groups, solidarity groups, just getting funds, buying things to take to. There are a lot of communities that are not going to have electricity for another 6 months, if at all. So there are a lot of groups working with folks outside, raising money, buying small solar and battery units to be able to say, if the electrical authority is never going to get to you, they've pretty much written you off. This is your best, bet. Start building community-based energy grids. Later on, you can talk about, if they plug in or not. But the inspiring thing is that there is a huge amount of that going on. There's a huge effort also to try to recover sustainable agriculture. Puerto Rico agriculture, as industrialization took place, they basically said, forget it, the future is industry. 80–85% of whole food is imported. So a lot of people are saying, just like the fossil imports, that we can't afford to continue doing this. So there's a lot of energy, a lot of really good things. The issue is, will they have enough weight to balance the weight of the powerful politicians, lawyers, financial, investors, and all that kind of stuff. It's, I wish I had a more enlightening, optimistic thing. But anyway, some people from the steering committee of that group are going to be in the Boston area. Northeastern University Global Resilience Institute is having a first annual Resilience Network Research Group symposium. And they're coming to that, and a number of us are trying to see if they can come for a few extra days and give talks and meetings at a few other institutions. I don't know if they will be able to. They have teaching responsibilities as well. If they do, I would definitely pass the word on, because they probably can answer some of these questions. Maybe not answer, but at least shed light much better than anything that I could say here, because they're dealing with exactly that question. The one that you raised, the one that you raised is, how do you make sure that the population who actually lives there has a say in the future of how we get out of this situation?
There's some talk of, as always, a statehood. What is the feasibility of that happening anytime soon, and how?
The two main political parties since the middle of the 20th century have been what's called the Commonwealth, the Populares, which is the status quo, the current arrangement, the Commonwealth. It's actually, in Spanish, it's called Estado Libre Asociado, which means free associated state, but in English it's referred to as the Commonwealth. So there's a party that represents that model, which for many decades, it was kind of like the New Deal in the U.S. For many decades, it had overwhelming support because it presided over that massive development. Beginning in the late 60s, the pro-statehood party developed. Ever since, they've basically been, at most, they can get 2 sessions in a row where the governor is the same. It's basically back and forth. And the independence movement, which originally, in the early 20th century, was the most active, whatever, got absorbed into the Commonwealth one partly, or was repressed for many decades. So they've been sort of at the margins of things. People vote now. It's become a 2-party system like here. So people say, oh, I don't want to waste my vote voting. Even if I agree with these, I don't want the other party. So there's a lot of back and forth, and that's what's been going back and forth. You know, there've been several plebiscites on it, and yeah, there's no resolution. The current governor is from the statehood party. The one before wasn't. The one before was. His father was governor as well. So it's hard to say. Some people are going to try to take advantage of this and say it's clear that we don't have the resources without the FEMA and all this stuff. Why don't we just try to get? We don't get equal money. We don't get Medicare, all kinds of services. We don't pay federal taxes, but we pay Social Security. We pay all kinds of other things, payroll taxes. Why don't we just get the full thing? Because we're getting and everything else, we're getting like a portion of what everybody else gets. It's for many people it's compelling, but I think there's a lot of opposition to it as well.
Also economically, wouldn't that make more sense in order to have the right structures in place to be able to invest and to build the future in a more resilient way?
That's the argument that the pro-statehood folks say, right?
You don't necessarily think so. That's not
the reality in the island is it's because it's not just about the politics and economics. It's also like identity and all that kind of stuff. A lot of people just don't see that they will be treated the same way. It's complicated. It's waiting for the political status to get resolved to solve this kind of issue is basically dooming the problem to just stay in the mud, unfortunately.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm from the Heller School, and I'm working with Jeff, Ash, and Brian here, so nice to be back. Thank you also for updating us on how your family's doing. I hope they're okay. I have questions around your recommendations for what something like this could look like in Venezuela. So I'm from Venezuela, and right now there's a lot of traction with economists here in Cambridge working on their public debt and inflation rate. But Venezuela has experienced floods in the last 10, 15 years. And there's major concern for Latin American countries. But culturally, we don't talk about climate change. And there are ministries of environments now. But if Venezuela has a hurricane or some kind of natural disaster, there's no financial infrastructure. So could you recommend anything Venezuela could look into prepare for climate shock?
I don't even know where they could begin because it's in such a mess right now. But like anywhere else, they really should be taking. I mean, they're not in the path of hurricanes, right? Hurricanes follow certain paths, and Venezuela is definitely. I don't know if there's been one that went there. But the only time that I was in Venezuela, in Caracas, a few years ago, the thing that struck me is coming in from the airport into the city, is a huge amount of housing on the hills and the mountains and all that kind of stuff. And all I could think of was, wow, there was a seismic, if there was an earthquake here, or a massive precipitation thing where like for 2 or 3 days, you have massive rains and all that kind of stuff. The ground would give. I mean, it was scary to see so much, almost vertical, entire sides of mountains, just dense urban. I don't know. I mean, other than people thinking about that stuff, and but I think the political problems in Venezuela are so hard right now that I don't see this stuff getting any traction either. But
is there concern too with the state-owned enterprise model. That PDVSA is the major oil company in Venezuela that has become state-owned because the government definitely wants buy-in and control over oil prices. Are you familiar at all with the electricity kind of private sector system and state enterprise there?
In Venezuela, not so much, other than what I read in the news over the last 15 years. I mean, in Puerto Rico, there is a monopoly also, which is a power authority, and it had not been regulated. Now it is. There's a big question about the one positive thing in the last week, since the new proposals have been made, a huge number of people and experts are saying the last thing we need to do now is to weaken or get rid of the regulatory body that's new and actually doing its work. So that's, everybody agrees, whether you keep the state monopoly or especially if you break it up into private things, somebody has to look out for the larger good and make sure that nobody's making bad decisions or trying to rig the system. So I'm hoping that the debate, especially because there's so much cynicism about how organizations work in Puerto Rico, will lead to a recognition that you've got to have this balance. Just saying, and a lot of people in Puerto Rico, you read the comments in newspaper articles, sell everything, don't let anybody, don't leave anything unsold, just get rid of it all. But that doesn't bring together a plan for, if everybody, it's not like telecommunications, and actually they haven't had good luck with that, and that was privatized years ago also. But unlike telephone service, where you can say, well, I don't like this service, I'm going to subscribe to these. If they sell assets, somebody might own one power plant and the other. It's not that you can say, oh, I'm going to buy power from, it's more complicated in electricity than with just telephone service. But there's no capital, so a lot of people are saying, maybe that's one way. And technology is changing so much that now, especially now that they're saying we can't just have, we got to keep the old power plants, but we got to build around them with all this. It looks like the one positive thing is that regardless of how investments in renewables are just going to shoot through the roof. But now everybody's talking about we got to get to like at least 30% as soon as possible. Before that, they were talking about, well, maybe one day we'll get to 12, and they were supposed to be there, but that's 2. So there's an acknowledgement and realization that, well, let's just see. I mean, if people are selling certain kind of technology or service and they can fit in and work within a larger picture, that, if there's a guiding force that says, yes, this is going to go towards making sure that rates are affordable for the population and for small businesses and to ensure that, we have stability and all that, then it can work. But it all depends on the devil is in the